I'd like to introduce Taylor Ginieczki, NUCSJ Director of Civic Engagement, who will be moderating panel 2. Taylor studies international relations, French, and Spanish at the University of Oregon. At the UO, she's editor-in-chief of the interdisciplinary Oregon Undergraduate Research Journal. Taylor is originally from Santa Cruz, California, and her research interests include integrating academic knowledge about geopolitical security into both public consciousness and government policy.
Okay, Shloka, thank you so much for that introduction. I really appreciate it. So for the second panel from NUCSJ, Science and Partisanship, I would like to introduce Dr. Helio Fred Garcia, Dr. Daniel Cornfield, and Dr. Mark Kane as our panelists. So Dr. Garcia is a professor of management and communications at NYU and a professor of professional development and leadership at Columbia University. He's also a senior fellow at the Institute of Corporate Communication at Communication University of China in Beijing. And currently, Dr. Garcia is president of the crisis management firm Logos Consulting Group and executive director of the Logos Institute for Crisis Management and Executive Leadership. Dr. Cornfield is a professor of sociology, political science, and American studies at Vanderbilt University. He's editor-in-chief of the journal Work in Occupations and a fellow of the Labor and Employment Relations Association, and he has chaired the Metropolitan Nashville Human Relations Commission, a mouthful. Dr. Cornfield's work has been widely published in journals like the American Journal of Sociology, Social Forces, and the ILR Review, and he is an expert in the American labor movement, the creative class, and work and occupation issues more generally. And our last panelist, last but not least, Dr. Kane, is the G. Unger Vetlesen Professor of Earth and Environmental Sciences at Columbia University. He has been a fellow of the Oceanography Society since being honored with this in 2014. Dr. Kane is a leader in his areas of focus, which include climate modeling and forecasting, paleoclimate, and the impacts of climate on society. And he is known by the international scientific community for his work on the first ever successful forecasting model of El Nino, which came to fruition in 1985. So before questions, I would like to ask every panelist to briefly share a sentence or two about their recent or current work. So Dr. Garcia, would you like to start us off? Oh, I think you're muted.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here, delighted to have the opportunity to work with my colleagues, Mark Crane and Dr. Cornfield. Never met before, but I'm delighted to share the panel with you. Thank you. I am currently about 3/4 of the way through my next book, which is on the US response to COVID and contrasting it with the response to COVID in other countries, and paradoxically, including countries that followed all US CDC guidelines, unlike ours. And a big part of the work I'm doing is to track and study the misinformation that was prevalent throughout COVID and continues to be prevalent today. I note the sad milestone today. We are 11,000 confirmed fatalities away from 1 million. And that is genocide level fatalities. And about 900,000 of those fatalities could have been prevented, but they weren't for reasons we're going to be talking about here.
Thank you so much. And our next panelist, let's see, Dr. Cornfield.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I meet my co-panelists for the first time and all of the students involved here. It's a real pleasure and honor. My work as a sociologist, I've been looking at a couple of book projects on the social conditions that encourage inclusive and expressive democratic discourse, particularly in capitalist democracies such as the USA. And so one book project is on the origins and impact of the nonviolent Nashville civil rights movement of the 1960 period that was Martin Luther King inspired and led by the Reverend James Lawson, who's also a co-author on our book. And then another project looking at the role of local arts agencies, such as local arts commissions and in civil society in encouraging the expression of counter narratives and in local democratic discourse throughout the United States. That's a project that is funded by the National Endowment for the Arts and in collaboration with Americans for the Arts.
Great, thank you so much. And then Dr. Kane.
Yes, thank you for having me. I'm currently working on three things. One is reconstructing climates of the past on the theory that that informs the future. Two is showing that recent changes in the North Atlantic are largely due to human interference in the climate system rather than the prevailing paradigm, which is variations internal to the climate system. And the final thing is based on the observations that the zonal temperature gradient in the tropical Pacific, which has profound impact on global climate, has strengthened in the past decades, which is sort of like what's called a La Nina event, whereas models have done the opposite, and for the most part. Okay, and the difference is in the future, if these changes that have occurred reflect influence of greenhouse gases and other things, then nature says there'll be more Atlantic hurricanes and the models say there'll be fewer.
Thank you all so much for being here, and welcome everybody. So we will now begin our moderated question period, and we're going to leave some time at the end so our audience can ask our speakers some questions. So during this panel, please direct all your questions to Shamel, via our new link, which is the slide.io. And I think that will be sent in the chat in a moment. And I think I'll be running this panel slightly differently from Davis as well, and that each question topic will be more specialized and personalized for each professor. And so while any panelist can answer questions from any topic, and we would love a discussion, there are no expectations that everyone on our panel will be equally familiar with topics outside of their wheelhouse. So our first topic is about methods of access to scientific information and how this plays a role in the consumption of information, possibly misinformation as well. So our first question, which I will first direct to Professor Cornfield, is what role, if any, does consensus play in science? And as a truth-seeking enterprise, should differences in opinion be welcomed or challenged?
Well, the question of consensus in science usually is handled, I think, through the peer review process and through publication ultimately in scientific journals. I'm speaking as a social scientist, not as a natural or physical scientist. Typically in social science, we don't enjoy much consensus on most research. And so what we publish is peer-reviewed participations in debates. So, but I think the key issue of developing any kind of consensus or leaving some kind of legacy of knowledge through in professional science or organized science, including social science, generally occurs through a peer review process that is controlled by a trained profession, meaning a profession that's trained in the traditions and methods and theoretical perspectives for making innovations in that knowledge domain. And they're usually organized into scientific communities, professional societies that attempt to disseminate their knowledge through what they would consider to be an authoritative peer-reviewed process.
If I could comment briefly, the second part of this question is, as a truth-seeking enterprise, should differences in opinion be welcomed or challenged? And the correct answer to me is they should be welcomed and challenged. That's almost the definition of scientific method, insofar as there is something like scientific method. And Alfred North Whitehead, who was a philosopher of science, put it this way: seek simplicity, then distrust it. You should challenge your own ideas as well as those of all of those people who you know to be wrong. That is, everyone who disagrees with you.
Dr. Garcia, would you like to jump in as well?
I'm sorry?
Would you like to jump in as well?
I am not a scientist. I am just thrilled that Alfred North Whitehead was quoted. My formal training was in ancient Greek philosophy. And as you know, I teach ethics in the engineering school at Columbia. I teach science ethics, and I teach communication ethics at New York University. So I don't believe I have sufficient qualification, being not even a social scientist, to offer an opinion on that, but I'm delighted with what I've heard. I do recall as an undergraduate reading Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And my takeaway from that is sometimes you need to be aware of the consensus, because as the paradigm shifts, people who have an investment in the old way are going to be deeply resistant. So that's all I'll say.
Wonderful. And I think Shloka might have quoted that in her intro address as well. So there's all dovetailing. It's perfect.
Great.
The next question is, how has social media changed the ways in which scientific information is shared? And do you think that social media companies should do more to stop the spread of scientific misinformation on their platforms, given that some do view this as censorship, which we've seen definitely in recent news?
And who's that for?
Dr. Cornfield, would you like to start us off?
I'll be happy to start off. Social media is kind of a double-edged sword, at least, as most technologies are, but especially technologies that are designed to spread information and connect people or not, as the case may be. The question about who or what should control social media, to me, is from a sociological perspective. Social media and the institutions supporting it kind of exist on a spectrum, a continuum that runs between two hallowed values in our society. And they would be liberty on the one end, all the way over to community at the other end. And these two values often conflict with one another. And the question of how to control social media, especially from the perspective of the dissemination of misinformation and lies and fake science, et cetera, to me comes down to finding an optimal institutional arrangement that kind of optimizes between promoting liberty, which would err on the side of freedom of expression and, you know, the First Amendment types of rights, and then on the other end of promoting community, but not to the point where one promotes a bureaucratically controlled, authoritarian, surveilling type of community enhancing apparatus. So somewhere in between these two arrangements is how I think social media should be properly regulated. In practice, what that comes down to is actually what I was alluding to before, and that is organized scientific communities. So if I can just briefly, and then I'd be happy to pass the baton on to my co-panelists here, who I'm sure have strong feelings on the subject, as we all do. Tocqueville, Alexis de Tocqueville in the 1830s, in his great book, Democracy in America, wrote at least about the non-enslaved part of the United States, which could not fully vote as well, as mainly white propertied men who could vote at the time, but nonetheless saw it was writing about a society that was skeptical of concentrations of power, was very individualistic in its values. And what Tocqueville saw as the kind of balancing act that US society was going through at the time was the development of a vibrant civil society, meaning a set of intermediary institutions that intervened between individuals and families on the one hand, and any kinds of concentrations of power, even at the local level, which is where a lot of the governance was at the time. And I think that that same type of solution is probably relevant for today. And the forms of civil society that I think are most relevant to the question that you posed would not be media companies. That would be erring on the side of bureaucratic control. And I would hate to see a large corporation develop a bank of censors of its own, even though it would probably be legal to do so because they are private companies. But rather, I think the role of universities and organized scientific communities would be very important intermediary institutions that have to make themselves accessible to the lay communicating public in our democratic society. So maybe I'll leave it at that, and happy to pass the baton on to others here.
I'll take a stab. One of the things that is really interesting, just watching the life cycle of social media companies, is when they began to become controversial for the things that appeared on their sites, they made an argument that they were essentially a public utility and they couldn't be held accountable for offensive or objectionable content on their site, just as you don't hold AT&T accountable if someone makes a phone call in which they threaten somebody or lie to somebody. That's a public utility, and we shouldn't have to police the content. Well, that proved to be untenable. And as Facebook and Twitter and others underwent more and more criticism, they began to, in my opinion, really ineffectively establish standards and begin to police those standards, but the execution was spotty. It seemed to be arbitrary. One of my favorite phenomena was a guy who simply copied and pasted Donald Trump's tweets and posted them as his own was banned from Twitter because of the offensive and dangerous nature of his stuff. But the identical content on the original author's tweets, on the president's tweets, were not knocked off Twitter. It wasn't until the January 6th attack that President Trump was knocked off Twitter. So there's a good indication of how ineffective and spotty that enforcement is. So my own sense is these social media platforms are at their peak now, but they're going to be in descendancy. And I believe that in 5-10 years, Facebook will have been seen to be a quaint relic of the past, and there will be other things that we will be using to connect with each other.
If, social media get a lot of attention, and for good reason, but if I were to think about scientific misinformation and where it comes from that has the most strongest and largest impact on people, it's probably Fox News, not Twitter, Facebook, etc. And Fox News, after all, is, although it's a technology relatively new in my lifetime, and perhaps that of some of the other panelists, for you guys, it's old stuff, right? Just plain television. There was a change from the days when we all got our news from Walter Cronkite, who was reliable and stayed in the middle, to this day where you have a Fox News, which is wildly able to say, it's very partisan, it says what it wants. Okay. The second part of this is that the other great source of information is not one individual or another, but it's the corporations that have, tremendous resources. So in the area of climate change, Okay, it's been fossil fuel companies and their advertising. And even now, gas companies are telling you how wonderful it is to cook with gas when it's perhaps just as wonderful and a lot better environmentally to cook with an induction cooktop. Okay, but they keep advertising gas. They keep pushing it on you. This is a kind of misinformation. And I think it dwarfs what goes on. I can't say that with confidence because I don't know the numbers, but I think the emphasis on social media is almost a misdirection away from the more powerful problems in our society, which have to do with Exxon or other corporations that have done this, and perhaps with Fox News, and more generally now with the Republican Party, which has no respect for truth.
And oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Dr. Cornfield.
Oh, go ahead.
I agree with everything that Dr. Kane said. I would add one more, and that is one of the phenomena of social media is it becomes an amplifier and multiplier of what goes on Fox News or comes out of Fox News. And the surrogates for the fossil fuel companies who find creative ways to get attention on Fox and through the amplification and multiplication through social media. So in many ways, Fox becomes the agenda setter, but the dissemination of that misinformation is accelerated through the social media channels.
Thank you all so much for those responses. And we are going to move on to our next topic now,
Sorry.
but really appreciate your thoughts. Thank you so much. So our next topic is on the COVID-19 pandemic and about information about public health. And so we're going to direct this first question to Dr. Garcia. So could you walk us through some of the most salient political, sociological, or economic forces that have shaped the government pandemic response at either the federal or the local level?
Well, thank you for that. The primary driver, in my opinion, of the US failed response is the President of the United States, who refused publicly to acknowledge the severity of the virus in its earliest phases, even as we now have the tapes, even as he was privately telling Bob Woodward of the Washington Post that it is airborne, that it is deadly, that it's more deadly than the flu, that you can contract it through breathing. And if you ask, well, what is the common sense response to that? The good news is the CDC had that covered, and that is masking and distancing and testing and tracing and quarantining those who are positive. But we never had a whole of government response. At best, we had fragments of government response. And the president engaged in massive misinformation. Now, there's a study that the Cornell Alliance for Science put out. It was published in October of 2020. And it had looked at 18 million news stories from January through May of 2020. And 18 million news stories in English that mentioned COVID. And it identified 1.1 million that had serious misinformation. So more than 1 million news stories with misinformation. And then it tracked the misinformation to the source. 37% of those stories directly quoted President Trump as the source of the misinformation. And another 13% quoted someone quoting President Trump. So 50% of the misinformation out there was either directly or one step removed from the President of the United States. And the Alliance for Science at Cornell said, here's why this matters. When people who are predisposed to believe what the president says hear him say that, they act on it. And by acting on it, they create a risk not only to themselves, but to people around them. And we saw the politicization of masks. We've since seen the politicizations of vaccines and vaccinations. And we can trace all of that to the earliest moments of the pandemic when the president signal to his followers, you don't have to wear a mask, you don't have to distance. Oh, we're going to reopen churches and synagogues by Easter. And that was madness. But one of my favorite quotes from the French philosopher Voltaire is, those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. Now, I usually quote that in the context of violence, but I think that also applies in the context of carriers of contagion because they believe the nonsense.
Thank you so much for that response. Dr. Cornfield, did you want to add?
Sure. I'd like to extend what Dr. Garcia has just mentioned. I think it's really right on target. And from a sociological perspective, such as my own, it's important to also recognize that pandemics, and specifically the recessions, the economic recessions and huge dislocations economically that immediately resulted when especially in April of 2020, for example, the unemployment rate in Alabama, well, in March of 2020 was 2.5%, which is like full employment. And then in April, it was 15%, which is like mass recession. And it's not as high as the Great Depression, but it was at least as high as the Great Recession of the early 21st century. Generally, throughout US history, recessions bring out the worst in most people. And the pandemic, coupled with the recession, severely exacerbated all of the pre-existing group tensions and social justice issues that existed in the United States. And so it's important to recognize that Trump was very smart in his capturing that historical tendency that would motivate his political base. And so it's even more, it's not just Trump. It's that whole social force that ran with it, and it resulted in January 6th insurrection. And all of those folks who were trying to stop democracy, they were not wearing masks. And so it's important to see that the way in which our society at the high levels responded to the pandemic, in part was part of a mounting anti-democratic process, even perhaps authoritarian type of political process that has been brewing in the United States for quite a while. And Trump just pushed it over the top with the pandemic in the almost genocidal ways, as Dr. Garcia was suggesting.
And if I can build on that, I agree with all of that. We saw the precursor when in the late spring, President Trump was trying to get people to stop being confined indoors. And so he'd started tweeting, liberate Michigan, liberate Virginia, and preserve your Second Amendment rights. And when I saw that tweet, I said, whoa, he's talking about gunplay and quarantine. Well, what happened? An armed mob, unmasked, stormed the Michigan state capitol, trying to get into the Capitol. And we later learned that they conspired to kidnap the Michigan governor, put her on trial, and execute her, all in response to Trump's liberate Michigan tweet and his liberate other state tweets with the Second Amendment mentioned along the way. So we can draw a direct line from that to 6 months later, the attack on the Capitol.
Thank you both so much for your responses. So as a follow-up question, and maybe Dr. Garcia can lead with this one as well, but it's up to any panelist. So given the racial and economic disparities among groups affected by the pandemic, do you think that shaping scientific communication around targeted audience, maybe age groups in particular, could help decrease the speed of misinformation, or the spread and speed of misinformation? So in other words, how can we best disseminate information in a socially conscious way? I'll
take a very brief stab and then invite my colleagues. As you recall, when the vaccinations first came out, there was significant skepticism in the African-American community about whether they ought to participate in the vaccinations. And sadly, the United States had a history of medical experimentation with members of that community. It is not an accident that the very first vaccination on television was administered by an African-American nurse onto another African-American nurse on television. And then there was a lot of work by the pastors of Black churches and Black civic leaders to move their followers, to move their community to accept vaccinations. And what we find is, I'm not convinced that scientific argument would have convinced those skeptical people, but what it took is someone they trust to model the behavior and let them know that however legitimate their concerns were, they don't have to worry about this one. I hand back to my colleagues.
That was a great answer. I mean, I think that in reality, people are not rational. They don't act on scientific information. Black and Hispanic people have good reason to distrust the medical establishment. Okay, and so it is, as Dr. Garcia said, that what was effective was targeting them, but not by trying to tell those people that the vaccine is wonderful, but by showing people they might trust doing it, by engaging pastors, people they do trust, to spread the word. And that's something you should never forget in getting in thinking about misinformation. It's not as important in some ways as the emotional context that it gets packaged in. Anyway, that's, I think that's a great answer, and it applies to so much more. Okay.
Thank you very much. Yes, go ahead, Dr. Cornfield.
If I can build on my co-panelists' excellent comments, just getting back to the issue I was raising before about the control of the flow of information and authoritative and trustworthy information and information that's used to promote trust. Before I mentioned the role of universities and scientific communities in aiding in that process, but I left out a very important institution, one that I'm sure is dear to many of the students' hearts here, and that is journalism. And the role of journalists in a democracy cannot be underestimated. And the bureaucratization of news is a serious issue. And Fox is just one example of the bureaucratization of news. And there's any type of very large bureaucracy or corporation that disseminates information constitutes the bureaucratization of news. And so I think one of the most important short run and long run solutions to the types of issues we're talking about, whether it's the eradication of racial disparities in health and well-being and belongingness and justice, et cetera, is the further development of a truly independent investigative type of journalism that doesn't just write feature stories every once in a while, but actually gets them out there on a pretty consistent basis, independent of any kind of bureaucratic editorial controls.
And on that, journalism in some ways was spectacular during the pandemic in revealing what was really happening behind the scenes and in government. I have to say, I've relied a lot on Bob Woodward's work about the pandemic, but as an ethics professor, I remain deeply troubled about whether in March of 2020, when Woodward heard President Trump say it's deadly, it's airborne, if you get it, your life is essentially over. He allowed the book to remain confidential until August 18th. And in that time period, 120,000 Americans died. So I wonder, did Bob Woodward have a duty to warn? A duty to say, hey, the president's telling you that it's safe, but he told me that he knows that it's not. And so there are also aspirations of journalism that, in my view, failed to fulfill the actual mission of that kind of quality journalism. And that is keeping private something that could have saved lives.
Thank you all so much for your thoughtful responses. I think it's time to move on to our topic number 3. And this topic is on the environment, climate change, and the spread of scientific information. And so I think that Dr. Kane is a specialist on this. So our first question for you is, how does anthropogenic climate change diverge from natural climate variation, and where do people, and maybe even undergraduates, get confused with the difference?
Great question. Once upon a time, there was global warming, okay? And then it became climate change, and there were 2 groups that made that change. One group was scientists who felt global warming isn't describing it correctly. It's really more general, it's climate change, okay? The other group were fossil fuel companies and their Republican allies who did focus groups and found that people were more frightened by global warming than they were by climate change. So they promoted the use of climate change. And one of the problems with climate change is exactly, the climate changes all the time. So what's the big deal? What are you worried about? Okay. And that, in fact, was the message that got through to a lot of people. Okay. And so just to answer the question a little bit, though, anthropogenic climate change involves what we humans who have the, let's say, lack of humility to call ourselves Homo sapiens, have done to the atmosphere and to the land surface, but mostly the crap we've put in the atmosphere, okay? Natural climate change is distinguished. It can involve 2 kinds of things. One is other things like volcanic eruptions and so on, variations in solar output that are natural but are not part directly of the climate system. And then there are internal variations within the climate system, like the El Nino, La Nina cycle, that has nothing to do with changing the external forcing. I mean, do you ever think about why is there weather if you live, especially if you live in mid-latitudes, okay? Why isn't every day like every other day? Why isn't it always the same as it is with seasonal changes, though, pretty much in the tropics, okay? And that's because the climate system, the atmosphere, is intrinsically unstable. It changes all the time, okay? So there's that kind of change, and then there's anthropogenic change when they line up in the same way. So you have natural heat waves. We've always had heat waves, okay? If you put that on top of the warming that comes with global warming, then you get even worse conditions, okay? Anthropogenic climate changes can also influence the natural changes. It's like the climate system has modes it likes, just like if you hit a drum head, it resonates in certain ways. So if you hit it with greenhouse gases, certain of those natural modes respond more than they used to and more than others. Those changes are trickier to tease out because they, of course, look like the internal natural changes. So the things we're sure about are those aspects of anthropogenic climate change that don't look so much like that. And they're bad enough. Certainly we shouldn't need to go any further to understand that we better do something and fast.
It's well said, especially about the urgency part, that's for sure. So
And-
our next question for you is, so 3% of published literature on climate change denies the phenomenon altogether. So how does a layperson, maybe an undergraduate as well, begin to navigate published papers about climate change, considering this, while avoiding misinforming themselves? And especially, how can non-experts distinguish truth from misinformation?
Well, they can't, not perfectly. I mean, let's be real. Those of us we like to think all that training and so on is worth something. Okay, and so it's very difficult sometimes. Part of it is when I look at, say, biomedical research that I absolutely don't understand, I trust the process and I trust where it's published a bit or who published it and so on. That's not perfect, but it's the best I can do with that kind of thing. I think the other things that are important is just to ask yourself, okay, where does this misinformation come from and what is misinformation exactly? So one of the things that was true about climate change was for a long time, newspapers seemed to feel that balance meant every time you wrote an article on climate change, you had to find some other guy who was a denier, a skeptic, whatever, okay? And that changed rather suddenly to, I think, surprising. It would be interesting for those of you who are journalism students to go back and look at this. But Andy Revkin had a piece one dull, otherwise Saturday on the right-hand column of the New York Times front page about how Jim Hansen had been muzzled by the government, okay? And that seemed to be a break. Thereafter, they seemed to stop feeling they had to always tell you what the few percent of people who disagreed had to say. So I think in that way, journalism kind of failed. To get the story out the way the story actually was, okay, because their notion of balance was unbalanced, okay. The second thing is you should ask yourself, where does this information come from? So, and sometimes it's hard to tell, but as I said before, much of the misinformation on climate change came from fossil fuel companies. And if you want to know how really bad it was, please read the book by Naomi Oreskes and Tim Conway called Merchants of Doubt. It's pretty amazing, and the main comparisons they make are with the way tobacco companies hid the truth, okay? And it was a lot of the same people were involved, actually. But read that book if you think misinformation is just something about how people are misguided because they don't know enough, okay? It's partly a concentrated effort to misinform you. The second thing to say is ask yourself, why do people believe what they believe, okay? Now, my favorite example is a woman who said, I don't want the government messing with my Social Security. Okay. Now you should ask yourself, does she not like the government because she's misinformed? Or is she misinformed because she doesn't like the government? Okay. And I think you all know what the answer is, okay? And there's this brilliant work by Kahneman and Tversky, and you should read Kahneman's book if you're going to be a journalist and understand how people, to get some sense about how people think. So a relevant concept here is confirmation bias. We all interpret information to confirm what we believe, okay? Scientists do it, everybody does it, okay? And so I think that to summarize as a kind of answer to your question, no, you can't filter out all misinformation, but question where the source is, and then also question your own beliefs.
And Taylor, if I can add one further thought, one of the skills I teach my ethics students is a question to ask when something doesn't seem quite right. 97% of the medical journals say there's a real thing of global climate change, 3% say they don't. I agree with everything that Dr. Kane said. The skill I teach my students is to ask a very simple question. In Latin, it's cui bono. In English, it is who stands to gain from this? And so one of the ways, as Dr. Kane says, look at the source. Sometimes it's hard to figure out the source, but if you ask, assume someone believes this to be true, who benefits from that belief? And I think you trace it back to the Exxons and Royal Dutch Shells and others in the world.
Thank you both so much for those thoughtful responses. So I believe that this will conclude our moderated question period, but we do have an audience question that I think many of our panelists can answer. So the question is anonymous, and it says, given science is a process and that partisanship is high, how can science researchers preserve their integrity while also checking their own confirmation bias?
Good question. Well, go ahead.
Well, after you, I was going to.
Well, I do come back to the issue of bona fide scholarly communities have to allow for internal debate and to publish the results of critically examined and critically reviewed work. And then there's the question of dissemination. And that's the big challenge, I think. It is possible, as Dr. Garcia mentioned earlier about, in reference to Thomas Kuhn, that scientific communities can mature and even die on the vine. And so it's very important for scientific communities themselves to remain vital and to not get hemmed in with a single paradigm.
Yes, and I think, part of the thing about scientists, you're supposed to, in most reputable journals, they ask you to report any conflict of interest. Are you getting money from some company to do this? People are, generally speaking, follow those guidelines, but not always. That's one problem. That's kind of easy because that's a violation of, kind of an obvious check on your own biases. The second thing is that if you're taught well as a scientist, you are taught to question, your own beliefs, your own confidence in what you're saying, and you try to guard against your prejudices interfering. Now, you don't succeed completely. Nobody does, but that's the process. It's about the best we can do. Feynman said that science is the method we've invented for not fooling ourselves. Okay. Well, sometimes we fool ourselves, but mostly it works. Okay. And that's really the best I think we can hope for, and it works surprisingly well.
Thank you both for those responses. Oh, Dr. Cornfield, do you want to jump back in for a moment?
If I could add for just a moment to extend that idea, as the editor-in-chief of a sociology journal, the way in which that scholarly community operates, yes, every author has to declare any conflict of interest, or at least share what their source of funding is, and that's routinely published in every article we publish. The other thing is we operate with what we would consider, at least in the social sciences, and I'd be curious to know what is normal in the other disciplines represented on the panel here, with what we call a double-blind peer review process. Double-blind peer review means that the external reviewers, who are experts in the field identified by the editor typically, do not know who the author of the article is that they're reviewing, and vice versa. The author does not know who the reviewers are. So we try to maintain as much objectivity as is humanly feasible through those two basic processes.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So I do believe it's time to move on to our discussion. And so there have been such incisive, amazing answers from everyone on this panel, and we truly appreciate your time. Thank you so much. This does conclude our audience question period, as well as NUCSJ's panel 2 on science and partisanship. And so now it's time for us to turn things over to Shamel for our peer discussions. So if our audience would please join those Zoom meeting rooms via the link in the chat, I think will be coming in a moment. We will now be having discussion moderators leading those conversations between participants. And so Dr. Cornfield, Dr. Garcia, Dr. Kane,